was constantly buying used PC parts, trading them with people online, putting together systems for friends, then deciding I wanted something different a few months later. I enjoyed messing around with computers, and it happened to save me a little money, because if I found a decent deal, I could usually sell my old stuff without losing much. This was in Ohio. I still lived with my mom and my younger sister then. My sister worked and got home around 5:30. My mom worked different shifts, so depending on the week she might leave before sunrise or not get home until midnight. The house was rarely empty for very long, but there were a couple afternoons every week where I had it to myself. I had a part-time job at the time. I'd come home covered in dust, shower, eat, and spend the rest of the evening watching YouTube videos about hardware or playing games with friends. Back then, Facebook Marketplace was still where almost everyone around me bought and sold computer parts. I also used Craigslist once in a while. Most of the people I dealt with were good. College students trying to build their first gaming PC, parents buying something cheap for their kids, or other guys who liked computers as much as I did. The computer. It had been my main system for a while, but I'd finally upgraded. I cleaned the dust out of it, reinstalled Windows, wiped the drives, and took a bunch of pictures in the garage. A friend of mine named Coop messaged me after I posted it. He said, "My coworker's looking for something like that. Mind if I send him your number?" I told him sure. I trusted Coop. We'd known each other since high school. He wasn't the type to hang around shady people, so I didn't think twice about it. The guy texted me later that evening. He asked normal questions first. We settled on a price and planned for him to come by on Saturday afternoon. Looking back, the only thing I remember thinking was that he typed like someone much younger than he actually was. Lots of abbreviations, random laughing emojis, that sort of thing. It wasn't suspicious, just something that stood out later. Saturday came around and my mom happened to be home, which made me feel a little better since I was having someone I didn't know come to the house. The guy showed up in an older white pickup truck. It looked like it had been used for work for years because there were scratches all over the bed and a ladder rack on top. He was older than I'd expected. Somewhere 40s. He had short hair that looked like he'd cut it himself and an old Ohio State hoodie. He smiled a lot. Maybe too much. Kind of smile someone keeps on their face through an entire conversation. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and thanked me for meeting with him. Everything about the actual sale was chill. I turned the computer on so he could make sure it worked. He clicked around Windows, opened Device Manager to verify the hardware, and handed me the cash. He talked a little more than most buyers did. He asked where I worked, asked if I built computers often, asked whether I planned on going into IT someday. He stayed talking longer than necessary after the deal was already finished. Usually buyers leave within 5 minutes. Eventually he loaded the computer into the truck, waved, and left. Then one night he sent me a text. It wasn't about the computer. It just said, "Found some crazy corners of the internet tonight, lol." I replied with one of those generic responses people send when they don't really know what to say. "What'd you find?" he answered. "Stuff people aren't supposed to see." Then he followed it with a laughing emoji. I assumed he meant conspiracy forums or something. I joked back that I wasn't interested in getting viruses on my computer. He replied, "Nah, not viruses. Dark web rabbit holes." That was the first time he mentioned the dark web. Back then, I think everybody had heard the term, mostly because of YouTube videos claiming they explored it at 3 in the morning or whatever. I figured he had watched the same kind of content everybody else had. I answered, "I'll pass." He sent another laughing emoji. That should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, every few days he'd message me again. Sometimes he'd ask how the new computer build was going. He'd send random memes. He'd make comments about things he'd supposedly seen online. The messages always had this weird tone where I couldn't tell if he was joking or trying to impress me. He'd say things like, "You wouldn't believe what's for sale on there," or "People hide all kinds of stuff from normal internet users, lol." There was always an lol or a laughing emoji attached to it, like he wanted everything to sound harmless. I never encouraged those conversations. I'd usually answer with 1 or 2 words before changing the subject. After a while, I mostly stopped replying altogether. I mentioned it to Coop during lunch. I asked, "Does your coworker always text people after buying stuff?" Coop looked confused. "What do you mean?" So I showed him a couple screenshots. He laughed, scrolled farther. He handed my phone back and said, "Yeah, honestly, he's kind of an odd guy. I don't really know him. He's friendly enough at work, but people say he overshares. Talks about weird stuff. Doesn't really know when to stop." I asked if he was dangerous. Coop said no. At least that's what he thought. He just makes people uncomfortable. That made sense to me. I'd met people like that before. People who didn't understand social boundaries. So I just stopped answering unless it was actually about the computer. Eventually, the texts became less frequent, but they also became stranger. One message asked if I'd ever heard of websites that disappeared after you visited them. Asked if I'd ever wanted to see what people are really like when nobody's watching. Again, everything ended with laughing emojis or comments saying he was just messing around. I never knew whether he expected me to laugh with him. I usually ignored those messages completely. A couple weeks passed without hearing from him. One afternoon, I had the house to myself. My mom was working an extra shift. My sister wouldn't be home until later. I was spending most of that afternoon trying to troubleshoot an issue with a graphics driver because I'd installed a used card that kept crashing whenever I launched certain games. I had YouTube playing on the second monitor while I worked, and I was halfway through reheating pizza when someone knocked on the front door. I assumed it was a package delivery. We got deliveries all the time, and sometimes they'd knock instead of just leaving the box. I looked through the window. It took me a second to recognize him because I wasn't expecting to ever see him again. It was the man who had bought my computer. He was standing there smiling the same way he had the day he came to buy the PC. I opened the inside door, but left the storm door closed. "Hey," I said. "Everything okay?" He smiled wider. "Yeah, just wanted to stop by and see what you were up to." I was being confused more than anything. We weren't friends. We'd met once. I told him it wasn't really a good time because I was in the middle of something. He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he asked if he could come in for a minute because he wanted to show me something he'd found online. I laughed awkwardly and told him no thanks. His smile stayed there, but something about the conversation felt different now. He wasn't acting angry. He also wasn't acting like someone who'd just been told no. He simply stood there for a few more seconds looking past me into the house. Finally, he said, "You sure?" I told him yes. "I'm kind of busy." He looked around the front yard. "You home alone?" I didn't answer that question. Instead, I told him I had to get back to what I was doing. I started closing the door. Before it latched, he stepped closer and put his hand on the storm door handle. He wrapped his hand around the handle like he expected I was going to change my mind. I pulled the door the rest of the way shut and locked it. Through the glass, I told him, "You need to leave." I just wanted to talk. I shook my head. "Not today." He looked past me into the hallway again, like he was trying to see if anyone else was inside. Then he tried the handle. He let go for 2 seconds. Then he reached for it again. I stepped farther back from the door and pulled my phone out. I told him if he didn't leave, I was calling the police. Instead of walking away, he knocked again. He spoke through the glass. "I think you're misunderstanding me." How strange that sentence sounded in that situation. Nobody who accidentally overstays their welcome stands there testing someone's front door after being told to leave. I stayed where I was and didn't answer him. He kept talking. You know, people overreact about things. Nothing about what he was saying made me feel any better. I was watching him through the little window next to the door. He walked off the porch. I thought it was over. He walked around the side of the house. That scared me more than anything he'd done so far. Our fence didn't block access to the backyard. There was a narrow path between our house and the neighbors where anyone could walk through. I hurried into the kitchen because that window overlooked the side yard. I couldn't see him. I don't know whether he had gone into the backyard or whether he was standing where I couldn't see him. I remember yelling through the kitchen window, "Leave!" I genuinely didn't know where he was. I started checking the back door, making sure it was locked. I looked out the blinds in the living room. Nothing. I went back to the kitchen. It made me question whether I was overreacting, except for the fact that I knew exactly what had just happened. I heard tires on the gravel driveway. It was my sister. The second her car pulled in, I looked through the front window and saw him come around from the side of the house. He was moving fast enough that it was obvious he didn't want to be seen talking to me. My sister hadn't even turned the engine off before he backed out and drove away. She looked confused because she saw him leaving. When she came inside, the first thing she asked was, "Who was that?" I told her the whole story while she was still carrying her lunch bag. "The guy who bought your old computer? He just showed up? He tried opening the door?" She said we should call Mom. My mom was angry. She kept asking why someone I barely knew even had our address after all that time. The obvious answer was that he'd picked up the computer from the house, but hearing it out loud made me realize how little thought I'd given to that when I sold it. Nowadays I'd meet someone in a parking lot or somewhere public. Back then, everyone around me bought and sold things from their front porch. After that day, I blocked his number. Coop apologized even though none of it was his fault. He never would have given the guy my number if he'd thought something like that could happen. He asked around at work because he wanted to know whether the guy had ever acted like that toward anyone else. A week or so later, he called me. He said, "He's been asking if you've changed your number." He supposedly told another coworker that I'd stopped talking for some reason. That made my stomach drop because it meant he was thinking about it enough to ask other people. Coop told him he didn't know anything and changed the subject. After that, he started avoiding him as much as possible. Nothing else happened at the house. No more texts, no more surprise visits. Months passed. Coop called me one evening. He asked if I remembered the guy who bought my computer. I said of course I did. He said, "He's in jail." Coop told me he'd been arrested after his girlfriend had been found unalived inside a trailer they had been living in together. Even now, I don't know all the details. I didn't ask questions because I wasn't interested in reading about it. Just hearing that much was enough. I was sitting there with my phone in my hand, thinking about him standing outside my front door, asking whether I was home alone. A while later, Coop left that job, so I never heard anything else about the case. I was just one of dozens of people he'd interacted with. I'm Sylvia. I was living with my parents and my brother in a suburb in Ohio. I left the house a little before 8 every morning. This still feels so strange to me. Our next-door neighbors had lived there for years until they moved to North Carolina. Their house stayed empty for a little while before a woman around my age moved in. She introduced herself after the moving truck left one afternoon. I think her name was Beth. We only talked a handful of times. She seemed nice, worked from home. A couple of weeks later, I noticed a man staying there regularly. I assumed he was her boyfriend because his truck started showing up overnight every day. Eventually, I saw them leaving together enough times that I figured he'd practically moved in. He wasn't especially memorable. Mid-30s, dark hair, usually wearing work boots and plain t-shirts. He didn't smile very much. There wasn't any reason for that detail to stand out at the time. Some people are just quiet. My mom mentioned him once. Looks like Beth's boyfriend lives there now. For 2 months, life stayed the same. Sometimes I'd take a walk around the neighborhood before it got dark. I'd spend Saturday afternoons driving to Easton Town Center with friends. And one day, my parents were both working late and my brother had baseball practice. I had gotten home around 5:30. The house makes different noises depending on the season. During the winter, you hear the furnace kicking on. During summer, the air conditioner runs constantly. This was early fall, so it was one of those weeks where the windows stayed open because it wasn't hot enough to need the AC. I heard what sounded like somebody walking around outside, where our gate was. I looked out the kitchen window, but nobody was there. I walked into the backyard and looked around because we had deer wander through the neighborhood from a wooded area nearby. There wasn't anything. When my parents got home later, I mentioned hearing somebody outside. A week later, again I was home alone. Again I heard someone walking outside. Sounded like slow steps across the back patio. I opened the sliding door immediately because I assumed whoever it was hadn't gotten very far. Nothing. Our fence wasn't tall. If somebody had run, I would have seen them climbing it or heading into the neighboring yard. Everything was still. The only movement was our old maple tree because it was windy. After that, I started making little changes. If I got home before everyone else, I'd lock the back door right away. I'd check the windows before taking a shower. Months go by and people forget exactly when things occur, so I can't promise the order of every little detail anymore. I do remember that it was fully dark the night my dad found him. My brother and I were watching a football game in the living room while my mom was cleaning the kitchen. Dad had gone outside because he thought he'd forgotten a pair of pruning shears near the shed. We heard him yell, the kind someone makes when they're surprised and angry at the same time. My brother muted the TV, and all of us went toward the back door. Dad was standing near the fence with a flashlight pointed toward the corner of our yard. The boyfriend from next door was standing there. I can still picture where he was because that corner stayed in my mind every time I looked outside afterward. He was crouched down behind one of my mom's bushes. Dad asked him what he was doing. The guy didn't answer. He looked embarrassed. He said, "Sorry, wrong yard." That didn't make any sense. Our backyard was completely fenced. You had to open a gate or climb over. Dad asked how somebody accidentally ended up behind our shed. The man kept repeating that he'd made a mistake. He wouldn't explain anything else. Beth came outside while all of this was happening because she must have heard people yelling. She looked confused. The guy walked back toward their yard without saying much more. My mom asked if we should call the police. Dad said he hadn't actually caught the guy breaking anything or threatening anyone. He was just in the backyard. We all agreed it was weird, really weird, but there wasn't much else to tell. Time passed, at least on the surface. Beth waved if she saw us outside. Her boyfriend still came and went. If anything, he avoided looking toward our house. I remember asking my dad more than once if we should install security cameras after that. He said we probably should, but money was a little tight at the time because my parents had just replaced the furnace that winter. Cameras weren't nearly as cheap as they are now, so it turned into one of those things people keep saying they'll do next month. My mom started locking every window before she went to bed, even the little bathroom window nobody ever thought about. None of us talked about the guy very much after those first few days, but everybody was thinking about it. Beth was still living next door, and from everything I could see, she acted like nothing had happened. I don't know if her boyfriend ever explained why he'd been in our backyard. If he did, she apparently believed whatever he told her because she kept seeing him. Sometimes his truck would stay there 3 or 4 nights in a row. I'd occasionally see him outside while I was getting into my car for work. He never tried talking to me. He usually looked down or walked back inside. That made me feel better. I figured if he was embarrassed enough to avoid eye contact, maybe my dad confronting him had scared him off. The footsteps stopped too, at least the ones I noticed. That probably lasted another month or so. My bedroom was at the back of the house on the first floor. Across the hall was my brother's room. My parents' bedroom was upstairs because they'd converted the attic years before into a larger master bedroom. During the day, if I was home alone, I stayed downstairs in either the living room or my bedroom. My bed had a wooden frame with enough space underneath to slide a couple of storage bins. It wasn't especially high off the floor, but there was enough room for someone to fit underneath if they squeezed in. I had never thought about that before. Nobody thinks about things like that. I'd left work early. Our office closed at noon every other Friday during the summer, and afterward I picked up lunch on the way home. My parents were both working. My brother had gone with one of his friends after baseball practice. I expected to have the house to myself for at least 3 or 4 hours. That sounded nice. I changed into sweatpants. Around 2 o'clock, I decided I was going to clean my room because I'd been putting it off for weeks. It wasn't dirty, just cluttered with laundry that I'd folded, but never put away. I was thinking I should vacuum before my mom got home because she'd appreciate it. I carried the basket into my room and started hanging clothes in the closet. It wasn't one of those situations where I heard breathing or saw somebody move. The only reason I looked under the bed at all was because one of my socks had fallen onto the floor near the edge of the frame. I bent down to grab it. When I reached toward it, my hand brushed against something that wasn't the floor. I realized it felt soft. I got down a little lower because I couldn't quite see into the darker part underneath. I saw jeans, a shoe, then somebody's leg. I leaned another inch or two, and I saw part of a face. It was him, the boyfriend from next door. His eyes were open. He was looking at me. I wish I could explain what I was thinking, but I don't remember having a thought. It was like every idea disappeared at once. I dropped the clothes I was holding and backed away quickly. He started crawling out from under the bed. I screamed. Instead of trying to run through the front of the house, I went straight out the back because it was closer. I unlocked the sliding door, ran into the backyard barefoot, and kept running until I got through the side gate and into the front yard. I was yelling for help. I turned around just in time to see the man coming out the back of our house. He didn't even look at me. He jumped the back fence and disappeared between 2 yards behind ours. From the moment I looked under the bed until he was gone couldn't have been very long. The neighbor who came outside asked me what had happened. My parents got there before I had completely calmed down. I've thought a lot over the years about how terrifying that must have been for them. They got a phone call saying their daughter had found a man hiding inside the house. When my dad arrived, he wanted to go looking for the guy himself. The officers who were already there stopped him and searched the house first to make sure nobody else was inside. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been broken. Officers eventually figured out that the screen on my bedroom window had been removed from the outside. The police didn't tell us much while they were there. They asked questions about the neighbor, his truck, whether we'd had problems with him before. My dad told them about finding him behind our shed. Beth wasn't home when everything happened, but she came back while the police were still at our house. I remember seeing her start crying. She looked shocked. I don't know whether she had known anything. I've wondered about that for years. Part of me thinks she couldn't possibly have known. Another part of me thinks there had to be signs. The police found him later that evening. The man apparently had previous arrests involving stalking women in another county. There had also been complaints from at least one ex-girlfriend who said he'd secretly watched her and shown up outside places she regularly went. Just knowing there was already a history made me sick because it meant none of this had been random. I couldn't stay in a room by myself without checking under the bed. Beth moved away not too long after everything happened. I never spoke to her again. Sometimes I wonder how much she found out after his arrest, and whether she struggled with the idea that she'd been living with someone capable of doing something like that. I moved into my own apartment about 2 years later. Most people hear stories about stalkers on the news and think it's something that happens somewhere else. I thought that too. If you'd asked me before all this happened what the scariest moment of my life would be, I would have guessed something involving a car accident or getting seriously sick. I never would have imagined it would be bending over to pick up a sock in my own bedroom and discovering someone had been lying underneath my bed quietly enough that I'd been walking around the room for who knows how long without realizing I wasn't alone. The fact that while I was putting laundry away and deciding whether I felt like vacuuming, another person was already in that room, waiting without making a sound. I still don't know how long he'd been there before I got home, and I don't think knowing would make me feel any better. Even after all these years, if I come home to an empty house, I still find myself checking the rooms before I really settle in. Most days, I don't even notice I'm doing it anymore. It's just one of those habits that never went away. At that point, I was driving all over the Midwest for work. I worked for a company that installed and repaired weighing systems for grain elevators, feed mills, and small manufacturing plants. I'd leave home on Monday morning with a service van full of tools, spend 4 or 5 days bouncing between small towns, then head back before the weekend if everything went according to schedule. Most of the customers were regular people who just wanted their equipment working again, and after a few years, I got used to spending more nights in cheap motels than I did in nice hotels. I lived outside Springfield back then. A duplex that I rented with my dog until my sister convinced me she could take better care of him while I was traveling all the time. She was probably right. There wasn't much point having a dog if I was gone 3 or 4 nights every week. Every Sunday I'd stop by her place for dinner, see the dog, complain about work for a while, then head home and pack another bag. Most of my trips blurred together after a while. I can remember certain customers better than entire months because I'd end up talking to them for hours while waiting for a machine to finish calibrating. I still remember an older guy in Kansas who insisted I take home homemade beef jerky every time I visited. The company didn't exactly have a generous travel budget. If I needed a place to stay, they usually wanted something inexpensive unless there weren't many options nearby. That meant roadside motels more often than chain hotels. I had been sent to southeastern Oklahoma, close to the Arkansas state line, because a grain cooperative outside Broken Bow had a truck scale that kept giving inconsistent readings. The repair itself wasn't complicated, but the replacement parts I needed were delayed, so what was supposed to be one afternoon turned into almost 2 full days. I was being mildly annoyed because I'd been planning to drive home that evening, and instead I had to stay another night somewhere nearby. One of the guys at the grain elevator mentioned there was a motel about 20 minutes away. "It ain't much to look at," he said, "but you'll sleep." I wish I'd asked him more questions. By the time I finished the repair, it was getting close to sunset. My phone barely had any signal out there. I punched the address into my GPS and started driving. The farther I went, the less there was around me. The road narrowed, the houses became farther apart, and eventually I was mostly passing stretches of pine forest. The motel finally appeared around a bend unexpectedly. It was one long, single-story building with like 12 rooms lined up in a row. The sign out front had several burned-out letters, so at first I couldn't even tell what the place was called. I think it might have been Pine Ridge Motel or Pine Rest Motel. Half the sign didn't light up. Behind the building, there wasn't another road or another neighborhood. It was just woods. It looked like miles of forest. The parking lot only had 3 vehicles when I pulled in. Mine became the 4th. One belonged to an older pickup that looked like it had been there a while. Another was parked outside what I assumed was the manager's office. The third was an SUV with Texas plates. The office was attached to one end of the building. A woman who looked to be somewhere in her 60s checked me in. She was friendly enough, but didn't say much beyond asking whether I needed 1 night or 2. She handed me an actual metal key attached to one of those oversized plastic keychains that motels used to have before everything switched to cards. I asked if there were any restaurants nearby. She said, "Not this time of night." My room itself wasn't dirty. Old, definitely. The comforter had one of those floral patterns every roadside motel seemed to use 20 years ago. The bathroom sink took forever to get hot water. The window over the bed faced the parking lot. There was another window on the opposite side of the room behind a small table. That one looked into the trees. There wasn't much distance between the building and the woods. I called my sister. She asked if I was heading home the next day. I told her that was the plan unless something else broke. She laughed because that happened all the time. We ended up talking for like 20 minutes. That conversation feels oddly comforting because it was the last normal thing that happened before the night got strange. Around 9:30, I stepped outside for a few minutes. I noticed the Texas SUV was gone. That left only my van and the pickup. I never saw who owned the pickup. The only other person I remember seeing, besides the woman in the office, was a man who looked 50 or 60, walking from one room toward the vending machines earlier in the evening. For whatever reason, I assumed he owned the pickup. I went back inside around 10. The room became surprisingly dark once I shut the television off. I remember lying there thinking it was probably one of the darkest places I'd ever spent a night. I fell asleep. Later, when I checked my phone, I saw it had been a little after midnight. The thing that woke me wasn't loud. It was just knocks on the back window, like someone knocking politely on glass. I got out of bed and walked over. There weren't any curtains, just those thicker motel drapes. I pulled them aside and looked out. The security light left most of the woods in shadow, but I could still see the strip of grass behind the building. Nobody was standing there. I stayed at the window for half a minute, expecting someone to walk away or laugh because they'd knocked on the wrong room. Nothing moved. Maybe another guest had knocked on somebody's door, and it echoed strangely. I closed the curtain and got back into bed. I don't think 10 minutes passed before I heard what sounded like someone walking outside. They weren't close enough that I thought somebody was right outside the wall, but they were behind the building somewhere. That made more sense to me than the knocking had. I figured someone had gone outside to smoke or walk around because they couldn't sleep. The footsteps eventually faded away, and I rolled over, expecting I'd fall asleep again. Instead, I heard a woman crying, somebody trying very hard not to cry loud enough for other people to hear. It sounded distant at first, somewhere back toward the trees, and it lasted like 20 seconds before stopping completely. I remember sitting up because it didn't make any sense. There weren't many occupied rooms as far as I knew, and the sound hadn't come from the parking lot side. It had come from behind the motel. Still, somewhere beyond that back window, there was something else mixed in with it. It sounded like somebody saying a few words, but they were too far away to make out. I walked back over to the window again, pulled the curtain aside a second time, and looked into exactly the same empty strip of grass leading up to the trees. I couldn't see anyone. My eyes kept trying to adjust to the darkness between the trees, and every time the branches moved a little from the breeze, I'd think someone was standing there. It didn't help that the security light behind the building barely reached the grass before everything disappeared into shadow. I pressed my forehead against the glass for a better angle, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do if there really had been somebody outside, but at that point I still thought there had to be a reasonable explanation. Crying stopped again. I remember listening more than looking after that. Once you're in a place without traffic or nearby houses, you notice how many different sounds there are at night. I got back into bed, but I didn't bother trying to sleep right away. I reached over, turned the television on with the volume barely audible, and left it there mostly for the background. It made the room feel less isolated. 15 or 20 minutes went by. The crying never came back, but I heard footsteps again. They sounded closer. I could tell they were moving across the back of the building instead of somewhere deeper in the woods. There wasn't any hurry to the movement. I found myself looking toward the back window without getting up. Footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then came knocks on the glass, like before. There wasn't any question where the sound came from. I got out of bed again, mostly because my brain still refused to accept that somebody would be standing behind my room in the middle of the night for no reason. When I pulled the curtain aside, the strip of grass was empty. I looked farther this time, letting my eyes adjust as much as they could. The woods were dense enough that once you got beyond the first few trees, everything blended together. The trunks were tall pines with very little underbrush close to the motel, but farther back there were thicker patches that blocked everything. It was only for an instant, and I can't say it was a person. It could just as easily have been a branch moving. Whatever it was disappeared before I could focus on it. I locked the window. I wasn't convinced anyone was trying to get in. I just figured if somebody was wandering around behind the motel knocking on windows, I wasn't interested in finding out why. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, trying to convince myself that I'd leave first thing in the morning. At some point, I heard someone speaking, like a voice carrying through the trees. It wasn't loud enough to understand a single word. The strange part was that I only ever heard one voice. There wasn't another person answering. I opened the room door and stepped out into the parking lot after that. The older pickup was still parked a few spaces away. No one else was outside. I stood there long enough to listen. From the front of the building, I couldn't hear anything from the woods. The insects were louder than anything else. I wasn't even sure the manager lived there. After another minute, I went back inside. I slept maybe an hour altogether for the rest of the night, and even that's generous. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, I only know because I checked my phone, I heard something that bothered me more than anything before it. It sounded like someone was breathing outside the back window. The room's air conditioner had shut off by then, so it was quiet enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. Immediately afterward, I heard footsteps moving away toward the woods. I never went back to the window that time. Whatever was outside, I didn't want to know if it was actually there. Right before sunrise, I heard somebody try the back window, very gently. It only happened one time. After that, there were footsteps again, moving away slowly across the grass. There was nobody outside. I showered as quickly as I could and loaded the van before 7. To this day, I don't know what was happening outside that motel. I've tried to explain it every way I can.